I'm actually going to start this episode with a bit of a prologue. Why Exodus and why the plagues? I'm sitting here staring at my illuminated scripture journal. Now, for those of you who maybe have never heard of that, it's essentially an independent copy of the book of Exodus, but on one side is a blank page, and on the other is the text, so that you have the ability to draw or write notes or really whatever stands out to you next to the passage that is on the opposite page. I love these because I can dive deeper into Hebrew or Aramaic or different background context and write out points that bring extra ancient meaning to the words on the page that are so often lost to us. I have many of these books, but I have pulled the one on Exodus. When I open the pages, I'll find extra sheets of paper that fall out, and I can see the times where I went on a bunny trail on a topic, and one page just wasn't sufficient for my notes. Now, on a particular page, I've highlighted the menorah from Exodus 25, and I go into the distinct words in detail. I have highlighted words for stem, gane, hammered work, mishka, and cups and calyxes. Essentially, on this overused piece of paper, I am piece by piece setting out the framework for the building of the menorah. But that isn't enough for me. I want to know why. Why did the God of the Hebrews ask the builders to add details to the cups, made to resemble almond blossoms? Why did it need to be made of pure gold? Why was it positioned in the tabernacle where it was, and why does this even matter? What were the builders thinking as they were shaping almond blossom cups? What was in their minds as they saw the distinct ways that the tabernacle was being built? Did they inwardly marvel how Yahweh was taking some of the building details that they were familiar with from Egypt, but making them personal, showing through different objects that He alone was God? They were to be a nation, a kingdom of priests, led by Yahweh, who systematically dismantled the world which they lived in, and the world they came to know quite well, the world of the Egyptians. As they were building the horns for the altar for sacrifices, did they ever just marvel at it all? And really, what does this tell them about Yahweh? What did they think about God? You might be wondering what this has to do with the plagues, other than the fact that the plagues are also found in Egypt. Well, many years ago, I decided I wanted to deep dive, get messy, and really know on a personal level the book of Exodus. And the more I dove, working with scholars, asking questions of the text, researching, and doing more research, the more I found something incredible. I found the God of the Hebrews to be a distinctly personal God, not far removed from society, only interacting when He was angry with humanity or to play tricks on humanity as other gods did. His words, His actions, His instructions are all incredibly personal, not only to the Hebrews, but towards everyone in the text. The Abrahamic covenant, Pharaoh, the 10 plagues, the tabernacle, I've read it before, but something clicked, and I saw a God who was faithful to His covenant, has an intricate plan for all of humanity, and loves humans. Not a superficial or artificial love that is based on emotions or a 21st century definition that says love doesn't discipline and that everyone is inherently good and you do you and just love everyone and everything always. I saw the marriage of His love and justice, His love and wrath, His love and omnipotence, His love and holiness. When I took the time to slow down, ask questions, and ponder, I saw love. Now, as is the case with all history, there are still several things that are unknown that we have to mentally fill in and imagine. What was normal to them and culturally succinct is culturally foreign and distinct to us. I love what the plagues show us. And hopefully, I can reveal to you a bit of that wonder and context that makes what the God of the Hebrews is doing a lot more interesting than we realize. So, Yalla, let's do this.
Hello, shalom and marhaban. You're listening to Yalla, the podcast which works to combat lies, confront misconceptions, and hopefully, if I've done my job, challenge you to think deeper about things. I'm Amy, your friendly neighborhood biblical resource writer, and I'm so happy you've chosen to spend some time with me today.
If God wanted to free Israel, why didn't He send one plague? Why 10? Why attack the river? Why frogs? Why animals? Why crops? Why darkness? Why Pharaoh's son? Most of us know portions of this story. We've seen the movies, The Prince of Egypt, Gods and Kings, or the 1956 adaptation of the Ten Commandments. Entertaining, but that's as much as I'll say. Some of us have read about the plagues in the Haggadah at Passover, and some of us may recall a retelling of this story in children's literature. I bet that to most of us, the plagues feel random, and even maybe around the Jewish month of Nisan, redundant. But to an ancient Egyptian, every plague would have carried a terrifying message. Not simply that the gods were angry, but that the entire world was coming apart. An Egyptian apocalypse, I guess we could say. And that's exactly the point. Here's what most of us have learned, a bit of a recap, if you will. Moses and Aaron, his brother, go before Pharaoh, telling him to say, everyone say it with me, let my people go. Pharaoh refuses. God sends a plague. Pharaoh surrenders momentarily, but after circling the carpets in his lavish bedroom, I'm using my imagination here, remembers, wait a minute, do they know who I am? I am a god. No way am I letting the Hebrew slaves go. Offer for freedom rescinded. The Hebrews may not go, thus setting off a sequence of 10 extremely specific plagues. The final plague, the death of his son, is the last straw for Pharaoh. He wants these Hebrews and their God out of the land in haste. Pharaoh finally lets Israel go. Now, this extreme oversimplification is also true to what we read, minus Pharaoh wearing out the carpets. But let's pause a moment and ask a question here. If freedom is the goal, why the elaborate sequence? Exodus 7:5 says, the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord when I stretch out my hand against Egypt and bring out the people of Israel from among them. Exodus 12:12 says, against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. What do these verses actually mean? Now, imagine waking up in ancient Egypt for a moment. The Nile rises, the sun appears, the crops grow, the temples function, Pharaoh rules. Everything is working exactly as it should. The universe feels stable, predictable, ordered. The world was functioning properly, all because of Mat. Now, what is Mat? One of the most important things we need to understand before we talk about the plagues is how the Egyptians viewed reality itself, their theological framework and cosmology. But to give a brief creation account of Mat here, we need to talk about Egyptian cosmogony for a moment. That is just a fancy word meaning the origin and creation of the universe, according to the ancient Egyptian. Because to understand why the plagues were so devastating to Egypt, we first need to understand how Egyptians believed the world began. According to Egyptian creation traditions, before anything existed, there was an endless expanse of dark, chaotic waters known as Nun. There are some pronunciation differences with the names, but to simplify, I'll just say Nun here. Out of those primordial waters emerged the first dry land, a sacred mound rising from the deep. It was on the first piece of land that creation began. Egyptian texts describe the creator god Ra as bringing himself into existence. He was not created by another deity, rather he emerged into being and entered the cosmos through an act of self-generation. From that point, one of Ra's primary tasks was to establish order in a world that had emerged from chaos. He subdued and governed the chaotic forces that existed before creation and established what the Egyptians call Mat, the principle of order, harmony, stability, and rightness that held the universe together. Ra appointed the pharaoh to maintain Mat, order, and eliminate Isfet, disorder, in Egyptian society. Now, when we hear words like good and evil, we usually think in moral categories. We think of good as doing the right thing and evil as doing the wrong thing. But ancient Egyptians often thought differently. For them, something was considered good because it aligned with the divine order established by the gods. Evil wasn't simply bad behavior. It was anything that disrupted that order. In other words, the question wasn't merely, is this right or wrong? The question was, does this contribute to the harmony of the world or does it threaten it? Because to the Egyptians, the universe was not running on autopilot. The sun rose every morning because the gods sustained it. The Nile flooded because the gods sustained it. The crops grew because, you guessed it, the gods sustained it. The stability of society existed because the gods sustained it. Everything depended on the preservation of order and that order had a name, Ma'at. Now, technically, Ma'at was a goddess, but she was much more than that. Ma'at represented truth, justice, balance, harmony, and the proper functioning of the universe. You could think of Ma'at as the invisible fabric holding reality together. When the Nile flooded at the right time, that was Ma'at. When courts rendered justice, that was Ma'at. When families lived in peace, that was Ma'at. When the stars moved across the heavens in their proper courses, that too was Ma'at. To an Egyptian, all these things were connected. The social order and the cosmic order were really two sides of the same reality. To an Egyptian, it was extremely important to maintain order as it was directly connected to their everlasting happiness. When someone passed away, their heart was weighed against the feather of truth and justice, that is, the feather of Ma'at, and Pharaoh was intrinsically connected to the concept and goddess. Now, let's talk about Pharaoh for a sec. Well, let's be honest. It'll be longer than a sec, but let's talk about him anyhow. Before we can understand the plagues, we need to understand Pharaoh. Interestingly, even the title Pharaoh tells us something about his role. The word Pharaoh originated in the Egyptian language to mean great house, but initially was used when speaking of the royal palace. Think if we were to call our president the White House. Around 1500 BC, this title was a title used for kings. In addition to the title, Egyptian kings had personal names, such as Amenhotep or Ramses, and additional honorific titles were used as well, like King of Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. Now, when we hear the word king, we often think of a politician, a military leader, or a head of state. An Egyptian would have thought of something much bigger. Pharaoh was not merely a ruler, he was viewed as the actual living representative of divine authority on earth. In fact, Egyptians believed that the stability of their world depended on him. The regular flooding of the Nile, the prosperity of the land, the order of society, and even the maintenance of the cosmos were all tied directly to Pharaoh's ability to uphold Ma'at. In fact, John Currid, professor of Old Testament at Reformed Theological Seminary and noted scholar, in his book Ancient Egypt and the Old Testament, notes just how central this responsibility was to Egyptian kingship. He writes, "A primary responsibility of Pharaoh was to confirm and consolidate the status quo of Ma'at and to maintain the order of creation through his reign. The importance of Ma'at for Egyptian kingship should not be underestimated. The idea of Ma'at played a central role in the king's identification with the god Horus. In the pyramid texts, Snofru is called Lord of Ma'at and Userkaf named Performer of Ma'at." Now, end quote there. Think about what that means. Pharaoh wasn't merely expected to govern Egypt well, he was expected to preserve the very order of creation itself. As a son of Ra and a divine ruler, it was his sacred duty to maintain harmony, stability, and balance throughout this land. In fact, each pharaoh was obligated to reestablish and reaffirm Ma'at as he ascended the throne. Forces of chaos could disrupt Ma'at, so with the arrival of a new king, order had to be established once more. He mediated between the gods and humanity. He oversaw the temples. He offered sacrifices. In other words, Pharaoh's job was not simply to govern Egypt. His job was to ensure that the world continued to function as it should. After all, he was described as the Eternal One, a God King, the life force over all the land. Okay. Enough about Pharaoh. He's had enough of our attention. Now let's talk about the relationship between snakes and crowns. But Pharaoh will be coming back into the picture momentarily. Snakes. Some are fascinated by them, and some are terrified. Here in Texas, by our many ponds and lakes, when you see one slithering towards you, you don't ask questions, you just keep walking. Well, what did the ancient Egyptian think about snakes? To the Egyptians, snakes inspired both fear and fascination. On one hand, venomous snakes posed a very real danger. Egyptian texts preserve numerous spells, charms, and incantations designed to protect people from snake bites, suggesting that fear of serpents was deeply woven into everyday life. Archaeologists have uncovered large numbers of protective amulets that Egyptians wore in hope of warding off these dangerous creatures. But the Egyptian relationship with snakes was far more complicated than simple fear. Many serpents were viewed as symbols of protection, power, and even renewal. Because snakes shed their skin, they became associated with ideas of rebirth and new life. Some were believed to serve as guardians, watch over both the living and the dead. This theme appears throughout Egyptian literature. For example, in the Book of the Gates, a funerary text, that's just a fancy way of saying a religious document designed to assist the dead and the afterlife. In this text, it describes the sun god's nightly journey through the underworld. Serpents are portrayed as protectors who defend him from the forces of chaos. Some are even described as breathing or spitting fire against the enemies as he travels through the darkness. So when an Egyptian looked at a serpent, they didn't see a simple symbol. They saw something powerful and mysterious. A serpent could represent life, protection, and divine authority, but it could also represent danger, chaos, and destruction. In many ways, the snake embodied both sides of the Egyptian worldview. It could be a guardian or an enemy, a sacred symbol or a threat to be feared. Now, what's the relationship with snakes and Pharaoh? Well, if you've ever seen images of Egyptian kings, you've probably noticed a cobra rising from the front of Pharaoh's crown. That serpent wasn't simply decorative. It was a powerful symbol of divine authority and protection. The cobra represented the goddess Wadjet, the patron deity of Lower Egypt. Egyptians believed she protected the king and defended him against his enemies. The image of the rearing cobra, known as the uraeus, symbolized royal power, divine favor, and the king's right to rule. Alongside Wadjet was another important goddess named Nekhbet, often depicted as a vulture goddess. She was associated with Upper Egypt and served as Pharaoh's protector as well. Now, together, Wadjet and Nekhbet represented the might and power of Upper and Lower Egypt. Their images frequently appeared on royal crowns, signifying that Pharaoh ruled over a united kingdom under the protection of powerful divine forces. For an Egyptian, these symbols communicated something. Pharaoh was not ruling by his own strength. The gods stood behind him. Again, quoting from Currid's book, he writes on page 89, quote, "The two goddesses and the sovereignty they imparted to Pharaoh were physically represented on the front of the king's crown in the form of an enraged female cobra. To the Egyptian, the royal diadem was an object charged with power and was, in fact, not always distinguished from the goddesses themselves, an inanimate object thought to be energized with a divine sovereignty and potency. The uraeus came to be considered the emblem of Pharaoh's power." End quote. Now, a uraeus was simply the stylized, upright form of the Egyptian cobra that was worn on the foreheads of the pharaohs. You've probably seen this depicted in pictures and movies. In essence, the ancient king believed that this crown would terrify the king's foes, as it filled him with supernatural abilities and supernatural powers. This is seen in a collection of Egyptian hymns, which Curd beautifully explains in detail in his book, if you're interested. But for our podcast purposes, we'll try to keep it simple. All right. I know I just threw lots of ancient theological facts at you, and I promise these will be incredibly relevant and give you that beautiful Eureka-esque aha moment in the future. This stuff really does matter and is going to make the plagues much more powerful. Some of you may have already been connecting dots as I've been speaking, but nevertheless, it becomes very interesting. I just love this stuff, and hopefully you'll come to love some of it too over time. It's just way too cool. Okay, let's talk about the hidden theme of decreation. Now, decreation is exactly how it sounds. Creation is the making of something, correct? In simple layman terms. So decreation is the deconstruction of something. What is the first thing God does in Genesis? He brings order from chaos. Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 and 2 in Hebrew says, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz, ve'haaretz hayata tohu vabohu, ve'choshech al pnei tehom, ve'ruach Elohim merachefet al pnei hamayim. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. That's from the ESV version there. There's so much to say about these verses alone, but I'm trying to behave and not go on more tangents. As y'all know, if you've been listening thus far, I typically do. But Genesis 1 will be a future episode. Oh, it's so good. So here, God is about to bring order out of primordial chaos. Tohu va or wa, depending, it's a whole nother story about the vav, but for our sakes, we're going to say va. Tohu vabohu in Hebrew. Now that's just fun to say, tohu vabohu. But it's a wilderness, the absence of order, purpose, and without function. And God brings it to life. The waters organize, light shines, land emerges, life appears, order is seen, harmony is felt, image bearers are made and walk with God, and creation flourishes. In Exodus, the process begins to reverse. Water becomes death, land becomes cursed, animals become destructive, food disappears, light vanishes, life is lost. The plagues are not simply punishments, they're an unmaking, if you will, or Egypt is experiencing creation in reverse. Yahweh is confronting Egypt's religion. Its gods cannot save it. Egypt's economy, its wealth cannot save it. Egypt's creation story, its understanding of reality cannot save it. Egypt's king, Pharaoh, cannot save it. Egypt's confidence, its certainty about how the world works, cannot save it. Every plague asks the same question: who actually rules the world? So, why does this matter beyond the story itself? Why are we diving into this other than it's amazingly cool, which I hope to point out? But anyhow, Egypt believed its system was permanent. She believed she was at the center of the world, everything revolved around her. Her gods seemed secure, her economy seemed unstoppable, her ruler seemed untouchable. Then, one by one, those certainties collapsed. And as we move throughout the series, we will explore just how specifically these things break down and how this has an effect not only in Egypt, but throughout the surrounding regions and on the hearts of the people. It's quite fascinating what God does here. It's almost like He had an intricate plan all along. So, in our next episode, we will explore both the Nile and the message Moses delivers when Aaron throws down his staff before Pharaoh. God throws down the mic real quick here. You'll see there's no real preamble, it's game on. God's saying, okay, my turn. The Exodus story is often told as a contest between Moses and Pharaoh, but that's far too small. What unfolds in the plagues is a confrontation between really two versions of reality. One claims that Egypt, its gods, and its king sustain the world. The other declares that Yahweh alone is Lord of creation. So over the next several episodes, we'll watch as Egypt's world is dismantled piece by piece and discover why the plagues were never random acts of judgment, but a carefully orchestrated challenge to everything Egypt believed was true, much like God does with us today. So, in closing, as always, know that you have value, that you are created for a unique purpose, and that you are deeply loved by God. Ma'asalem, ve'leitrot, we'll chat soon.